The year was 1967, and the golden age of Hollywood was transforming into something new, something electric. The old guard of crooners and silver screen legends was colliding with a new wave of international talent, and nowhere was this cultural shift more apparent than on the backlot stages of MGM Studios. Frank Sinatra, the chairman of the board himself, was at the absolute peak of his power, not just as an entertainer, but as a force in Hollywood politics, a man whose word could make or break careers. At 52 years old, Sinatra commanded respect through a combination of legendary talent and an equally legendary temper. He surrounded himself with an entourage that reflected his larger-than-life persona, and chief among them was a mountain of a man named William Big Bill Henderson. Standing 6'7" and weighing in at a staggering 350 pounds, Big Bill wasn't just large, he was architecturally imposing, a human fortress whose mere presence could clear a room. Henderson had come up through the ranks of professional wrestling before transitioning into personal security, and he wore his toughness like a second skin. His knuckles were scarred from countless bar fights. His nose had been broken so many times it sat crooked on his face, and his reputation for brutality preceded him everywhere he went. In Sinatra's world, where egos clashed and tensions ran high, Big Bill was the ultimate insurance policy, the nuclear option that rarely needed to be deployed because everyone knew what he was capable of. But on this particular evening, as the sun set over Los Angeles and cast long shadows across Soundstage 12, Big Bill Henderson was about to encounter someone who didn't care about his reputation, didn't flinch at his size, and certainly wasn't going to step aside just because some Hollywood tough guy told him to. That someone was Bruce Lee, a 27-year-old martial artist and actor who was barely recognizable compared to the global icon he would become. In 1967, Lee was still grinding, still fighting for recognition in an industry that saw Asian actors as perpetual sidekicks or exotic curiosities. He had just landed a role as Kato in the television series The Green Hornet, a breakthrough that gave him visibility but not yet the stardom he desperately sought. Lee was compact, standing 5'7" and weighing around 140 pounds. But what he lacked in size, he more than compensated for with an intensity that seemed to vibrate off him in waves. His eyes held a fire that unnerved people, a confidence bordering on arrogance that came from absolute certainty in his abilities. Lee had spent his entire life studying martial arts, not as a hobby or a performance, but as a philosophy, a science, a path to understanding the limits of human potential. He had trained in Wing Chun under the legendary Ip Man in Hong Kong, had fought in rooftop challenge matches as a teenager, and had recently begun developing his own martial arts system, something he was calling Jeet Kune Do, the way of the intercepting fist. To Lee, fighting wasn't about brute strength or intimidation. It was about speed, precision, timing, and understanding the mechanics of human movement at a level most people couldn't comprehend. The collision between these two worlds, Sinatra's old-school Hollywood muscle and Lee's revolutionary martial arts philosophy, was inevitable, and when it happened, it would shatter assumptions about what real fighting ability actually meant. The incident occurred during a private industry event at MGM, one of those exclusive Hollywood gatherings where deals were made over cocktails and egos were massaged with calculated precision. Sinatra was there as both performer and power broker, holding court in a private backstage area that had been converted into a VIP lounge complete with a full bar, leather couches, and enough cigarette smoke to fog a small theater. The guest list read like a who's who of 1960s entertainment. Studio executives, A-list actors, directors, producers, and various hangers-on who orbited these celestial bodies hoping some of the light would shine on them. Bruce Lee had been invited somewhat reluctantly, his rising profile from the Green Hornet earning him a spot, but not yet the respect he deserved. He arrived with his wife Linda, both of them dressed impeccably, Lee in a tailored suit that couldn't hide the coiled athleticism of his frame. From the moment he entered the room, Lee could feel the weight of condescension, the subtle ways people dismissed him with their eyes before turning back to more important conversations. He had experienced this racism his entire career, the bamboo ceiling that kept Asian actors in subordinate roles. But Lee's response wasn't to shrink or accommodate, it was to become undeniable, to force recognition through sheer excellence. He mingled politely, demonstrating the social grace his mother had taught him in Hong Kong, but inside he was calculating, watching, waiting for the opportunity to prove himself. That opportunity came in the form of a conversation near the bar, where a group of stunt coordinators and fight choreographers were discussing upcoming projects. Lee approached, eager to network, to demonstrate his knowledge and perhaps secure more work beyond his television role. He began talking about martial arts, about the difference between theatrical fighting and real combat, about how Hollywood's portrayal of fighting was laughably unrealistic. The stunt coordinators were initially dismissive. Here was this television actor, this kid from a campy superhero show, trying to lecture them about fighting. But Lee wasn't just talking, he was offering to demonstrate. Word of this spread through the room with the speed of wildfire, and soon a small crowd had gathered, including Frank Sinatra himself, who loved nothing more than a spectacle. Someone suggested Lee show them some moves, maybe break a board or do some of those karate chops they'd seen in movies. Lee smiled patiently and explained that board breaking was a demonstration of power, not fighting skill, but if they wanted to see real martial arts, he would need a volunteer. The room fell silent for a moment, that pregnant pause before someone does something stupid, and then Big Bill Henderson stepped forward. He had been standing in the corner, nursing a whiskey, watching this little Chinese guy get all this attention, and something in his reptilian brain decided this was a challenge that needed to be answered. "I'll volunteer," Henderson said, his voice like gravel in a cement mixer, and the crowd rippled with nervous excitement. Frank Sinatra's eyes lit up. This was exactly the kind of drama he lived for, the unexpected moment that would become a story told and retold at every party for years to come. Lee looked at Henderson, his expression neutral, but those who knew him well could see the slight tightening around his eyes, the way his weight shifted imperceptibly onto the balls of his feet. "I don't want to hurt anyone," Lee said carefully, but Henderson laughed, a booming sound that seemed to rattle the glasses on the bar. "Kid, you couldn't hurt me if I gave you a free shot," the big man said, and a crowd laughed with him, that cruel laughter of spectators who think they're about to see someone humiliated. Sinatra took a drag from his cigarette and leaned forward in his chair, clearly amused. "Show us what you got, Bruce," he said, and there was something in his tone that was both encouraging and mocking, the voice of a man who assumed this would end with the little guy embarrassed and everyone having a good laugh. What happened next would become legend, though the exact details would be disputed and embellished over the years. Lee agreed to a simple demonstration. Henderson would throw a punch, and Lee would demonstrate a basic defensive technique. Nothing dangerous, nothing that would actually hurt anyone. Henderson agreed with the confidence of a man who had never been seriously challenged by someone half his size. They moved to a clear area, the crowd forming a loose circle around them, and you could feel the electricity in the air, that mixture of anticipation and bloodlust that accompanies any potential violence. Henderson set himself, raising his massive fists, and threw a looping right hand at about half speed. He wasn't trying to actually hit Lee, just giving him something to work with for the demonstration. What happened in the next 2 seconds would fundamentally alter everyone's understanding of what fighting meant. Lee didn't block, didn't step back, didn't do any of the defensive moves people expected. Instead, he intercepted Henderson's punch mid-flight with a lightning-fast paksao, a slapping block that redirected the force of the punch while simultaneously striking Henderson's extended arm with enough precision to temporarily disrupt the nerve function. Before Henderson could even process what had happened, Lee had closed the distance, his body moving with a fluidity that seemed to defy physics, and delivered a 1-inch punch directly to Henderson's solar plexus. For those unfamiliar with Lee's famous 1-inch punch, it's a technique that generates explosive power from minimal distance, using whole-body mechanics rather than just arm strength. The sound was like a heavy bag being hit with a baseball bat, a deep, hollow thump that every person in that room felt in their chest. Henderson's eyes went wide, his mouth opening in a surprised "oh" as all the air evacuated his lungs in a single explosive breath. His face turned red, then purple, and for a terrifying moment everyone thought Lee might have killed him. The big man's knees buckled, and he stumbled backward, his arms windmilling as he tried to maintain balance. But his body had other ideas. 350 pounds of muscle and bone crashed to the floor with such force that bottles rattled on the bar and someone's drink spilled. The room went absolutely silent. That shocked silence that follows something nobody expected, something that changes the narrative. Henderson lay on his back, gasping like a fish out of water, his diaphragm spasming from the precisely delivered strike, unable to draw breath, his face cycling through various shades of red and purple. For a moment, everyone just stared, their brains trying to reconcile what their eyes had just witnessed. This little Chinese guy, this television actor who weighed maybe 140 soaking wet, had just dropped one of Hollywood's most feared enforcers with a single punch from 1 inch away. Lee stood over Henderson, his expression showing genuine concern now, and immediately dropped to check on the fallen giant. "Breathe slowly," Lee instructed, his hand on Henderson's massive chest. "Your diaphragm is spasming. It will pass. Just small breaths." It took nearly 2 full minutes for Henderson to recover enough to sit up, and when he did, his face showed something nobody had ever seen before. Genuine fear mixed with respect. Someone helped him to his feet, and Henderson looked at Lee like he was seeing him for the first time. Really seeing him. "What the hell was that?" Henderson managed to wheeze, still holding his chest. Lee helped steady him, showing the same respect you show any training partner. "That was Jeet Kune Do," Lee said simply. "The art of fighting without fighting. I redirected your energy and used your own force against you, combined with body mechanics you're not familiar with." Throughout this entire exchange, Frank Sinatra sat in his chair, cigarette burning forgotten between his fingers, his legendary composure completely shattered. The chairman of the board, the man who had seen everything Hollywood had to offer, was staring at Bruce Lee with a mixture of astonishment and something approaching awe. Slowly, Sinatra stood up, walked over to where Lee was helping Henderson into a chair, and extended his hand. "That was the most incredible thing I've ever seen," Sinatra said, and there wasn't a trace of his usual irony or coolness. This was genuine admiration from a man who rarely admitted anyone impressed him. Lee shook his hand, maintaining eye contact, and in that moment, something shifted in the room's power dynamics. "Mr. Sinatra, true martial arts isn't about size or strength," Lee explained, his voice carrying that teaching quality that would later make him such an effective instructor. "It's about understanding physics, leverage, timing, and the human body's vulnerabilities. Your friend here is incredibly strong, but strength without technique is just raw material. I could teach him to use that strength effectively, to channel it through proper mechanics." Sinatra nodded slowly, still processing what he'd witnessed, then did something characteristic of his complex personality. He laughed, a genuine laugh of delight. "Big Bill," he called out to his still recovering bodyguard, "I think you just got schooled." The room erupted in nervous laughter, the tension breaking like a thunderstorm passing, and suddenly everyone wanted to talk to Bruce Lee, to shake his hand, to ask questions about martial arts and how he'd developed such devastating technique. The stunt coordinators who had been dismissive 15 minutes earlier were now pressing business cards into his hand, talking about fight choreography opportunities, asking if he'd be interested in teaching private lessons. Studio executives who had barely acknowledged his presence were suddenly seeing him as a potential commodity, calculating how they could monetize this incredible skill set. But perhaps the most significant transformation was in Big Bill Henderson himself. Once he'd fully recovered his breath and his pride had been thoroughly humbled, Henderson approached Lee with an expression of genuine curiosity. "Could you really teach me that stuff?" he asked, and there was something almost childlike in his vulnerability, this massive man asking this little Chinese guy to show him the secrets of real fighting. Lee smiled, that rare, genuine smile that transformed his usually intense face. "Of course," he said. "But you'd have to forget everything you think you know about fighting. You'd have to start as a beginner, no matter how many bar fights you've won." Henderson nodded slowly, and incredibly, over the following months, he would become one of Lee's private students, training in Lee's garage in Los Angeles, learning that his 350-pound frame could move with speed and efficiency he'd never imagined. The incident backstage at MGM became Hollywood legend, one of those stories that got retold and embellished, but whose core truth remained undeniable. Bruce Lee had floored one of Hollywood's toughest guys in front of Frank Sinatra and an entire room of industry heavyweights, and in doing so had forced a racist industry to see him not as a sidekick or novelty act, but as someone genuinely extraordinary. Sinatra himself would tell the story for years, always with a mixture of amazement and respect, and he became one of Lee's unlikely champions in Hollywood circles, opening doors that had previously been closed to Asian actors. For Bruce Lee, it was another step in his long journey to change how the world saw martial arts and how Hollywood portrayed Asian men, not through accommodation or patience, but through undeniable, devastating excellence. Years later, after Lee had become a global phenomenon, after Enter the Dragon had changed cinema forever, Big Bill Henderson would tell reporters that the night Bruce Lee dropped him in front of Frank Sinatra was the night he truly understood that size doesn't matter, strength doesn't matter, reputation doesn't matter, only skill, precision, and the relentless pursuit of excellence matter. And in the end, that was Bruce Lee's greatest victory, not just winning a physical confrontation, but changing minds, shattering stereotypes, and proving that mastery transcends all the superficial measurements by which we judge each other.